want to sit with your daughter, it's fine.
I don't want to feel.
No, we can rearrange the seats. The tax can love you, just take your tax, put it wherever you want.
There's also an extra seat
There's
on
an
the
extra
end.
seat on the end. You want to sit there. That's how I
That's one from
yeah, I never. I've had some insurance or problem. Here, put those two at the corner. You don't want to sit on
My other daughter's coming. Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody, and everybody joining us online. Thank you so much for joining us. We have plenty of seats in the middle, unfortunately. So if anybody would like to come in, don't mind excusing yourself to sit down. We'd be happy to have you. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn the program over to Ambrose now to welcome you. Thank you.
Hi, thanks everyone for coming. I'm president of Lower Manhattan Historical Association, which is a group of groups interested in preserving the stories, lessons, and artifacts, history of Lower Manhattan, which, as we're going to find out, has got several hundred years to talk about. We have a fascinating program here. There's a lot of content that we're going to hear. I'm really excited about all of the speakers that we have. I'm glad to have you here. First, I want to call on Abby Suckle, who's the brainchild. This program is her brainchild about It Happened Here, which is highlighting this history. Abby?
Hi, first of all, most of you may or may not know there's over 1,000 things that actually occurred in Lower Manhattan that took place over the course of the last 400 years. And if you know, next year is, or 2 years from now is going to be the sequicentennial. If you can pronounce it, you can probably spell it. And next year is also the 400th anniversary of the city of New York. So we decided to combine the two and begin celebrating next July 4th and have a 5-day weekend, which will compress the history of our city / our country and our world into 5 days, of which basically every day will be a century, more or less. And it will be a combination of the usual things like walking tours and important speakers, but there'll also be a lot of special events. So stay tuned. There is a mailing list for some of our prequel events. Our next, I believe, is something about the history of the cocktail, which we're obviously going to have to charge for, but that will take place later this summer on one of those dog day summer afternoon evenings that we can really explore. I believe there were 5 cocktails invented in New York, so that'll be our next event. However, since you're all sober at the moment, the first thing I would like to do is we have to have swag because that's just what you do. So we've been experimenting with creating logos and t-shirts, and our tester is going to go to Scott so that it can get you excited for what to buy over the next year to help us celebrate properly.
Thank you, Abby.
And with that, I want to introduce our keynote speaker today, of course, is New York's best historian, Ken Jackson. And I don't even need to tell you how wonderful he is. So I'm going to let him share a compressed version of the history of our city / country / world in the next half hour or so. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Abby. I don't want you to stand up in the back. There are seats here, so there's places. I hope somebody can find a seat. Everybody can find a seat, I think. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me okay back there? Yes. Anyway, it's thrilled to be here. Thank you, Abby, who's a great organizer and who's getting things done, I must say. What a wonderful day it is outside. What a wonderful occasion. We're here to celebrate the history of the city and the nation. And I think to note that it's the anniversary time in a lot of ways, as Abby mentioned, the 400th anniversary of the first Dutch move to this place, really on Governor's Island for the late in 1624. And then in 1625, they of course moved to Lower Manhattan, and that's the date that the city has on its seal. And then in 1626, when the American Revolution starts, and when supposedly we bought the island, for $26 or $24. Of course, the Indians felt like we took advantage of them in that way and as well in every other way, because they had no concept, of land ownership. It was like you can buy all the sunshine and all the wind and all the water you want. And they thought land was like that. Didn't mean I couldn't grow crops on it or run my cattle on it. So anyway, it's a big story. I think we should call it 400 plus to acknowledge the fact that there were people here before the white Europeans first showed up. And that's important because it reminds us that we don't know how many indigenous people were here in 1624, but we do know if probably no more than 10 million, probably many fewer. And a lot of this nation is empty right now. Can you imagine if there's only 1/30th as many people then? But they were here. I mean, this was as natural a location for an urban settlement as there is on this planet. It has everything. This huge harbor, many people would say the greatest natural harbor in the world, certainly one of the 2 or 3. And it has the advantage of a river to the interior of the continent in the Hudson, and then through the Mohawk Valley, the Erie Canal, the connections to the interior of the United States. Halifax, for example, has a great harbor, but doesn't connect with anything. And Hong Kong has a good harbor, and San Francisco too. But New York is among the very, very best. And the fact that we need to recognize that the Lenape were here. And we want to celebrate Fraunces Tavern, the particular place where we are, because of course, George Washington was here a couple of times, once to say goodbye to his officers, and another time a week or 2 later, Evacuation Day, when the British sail away from the city, and that really ends the American Revolution. Although the war was over. We need to, we'll say a couple, I hope my telephone doesn't go off. But I want to expand our view here just a little bit, not much, but to say, as I said, the most historic spot in the United States. And what I mean by that is the square mile around us is, I think, the most historic place in the United States. In fact, I don't think there's a second place to New York. I mean, there are other places. Gettysburg is hugely important, but Gettysburg was 3 days and then it was over. And the places that are technically older than New York, let's say Jamestown, disappeared. If you ever go there now, it's a pile of mud. And there's one person maybe who lives there, and they've built a fake Jamestown a couple miles away in a shopping mall. Plymouth Plantation, also older than the Dutch in New York, 1620, but that also disappeared, and they rebuilt it somewhere a couple miles away. In Santa Fe, which was started in 1610, really was a wide place in the road until after World War II, and now it's become kind of a city. And then St. Petersburg, Florida, which is really the oldest white settlement, 1562. But that was, 3 padres and a donkey for 300 years. And it really wasn't a city, wasn't even on Florida maps as way as late as 1900. So I want to argue about this, and let's cast our gaze, could say 1,000 feet in all directions. And so this is the site. And so it has the location, it has the climate. Philip II of Spain, a little bit before this, had something called the Laws of the Indies, as he told Spanish explorers as they went around the world. And you find a place to make, he said, what do you look for? How do you know where to set up camp? He said, look for water. Without water, there's no such thing as people. I mean, water you can drink. 97% of the ocean water is salty. You can't drink it. Second, look for fuel. You got to stay warm. You got to cook food. That's wood. Where do we live? In a rainforest. You've seen those pictures of Manhattan before. White person. It's a forest. The whole place is a forest. And that's what it would be if we somehow were destroyed by nerve gas in a few hundred years. It's got a location, temperate climate, and here I'm going to aggravate people. It has no natural disasters. I mean, yeah, I know there was a hurricane a few years ago, but you know, in 400 years, that's not much. And even that hurricane probably wouldn't have registered in New Orleans or Florida. But it basically we have all the things that nature can do to make it a great city. So, by the way, I taught a whole class at Columbia University my whole life on New York City. So kind of condense that into a few minutes is not easy. But so I want to say what has happened here that makes it so significant, not at any one date, but all through American history. And that's what makes New York so special and so historic. Well, first of all, let's think of 1664. What happened then? The British show up, the Royal Navy shows up, 4 warships, some redcoats, and Peter Stuyvesant wanted to not surrender. He was the 4th Dutch governor and the most important, but they could see that those British warships could have blown this city to smithereens. And so ultimately, so they decided to just give it up, and with flags flying, they marched out of the fort. Fort Amsterdam was where the Customs House was, which is now the Museum of the American Indian. Then in 1697 is when Trinity Church starts. That's just down the street from here. Across a little bit. Why is it so important? Because it's by far the richest church in the world. It's so rich that they take up a plate, you know, for offerings, and then they give the money away to the homeless and people like that in the area, because it's got billions of dollars. And it's doing a lot for the neighborhood, by the way, now. The city grew to become one of the 3 most prominent urban places in colonial America, along with Philadelphia and Boston. Boston's the biggest city from 1630 when it starts until about middle of the 17th century. And it's Philadelphia, not New York, that takes over. Philadelphia looks like it has everything. It's a beautiful plan. It's on the Delaware River. It's well planned. It's a nice city. And it's the largest city at the time of the American Revolution. And it still is at the end of them until about 1800. And if you had to bet yourself, you just want to decide how to invest your money, Philadelphia is going to be the great city, because it's got beautiful plan. It's got between 2 rivers, and it's got the first bank of the United States, and then the second bank of the United States. So if you had to put your money down, you probably would have said Philadelphia is going to be it. Nope, didn't happen that way. Philadelphia is just a large suburb of New York City now. No, it's not even close to New York City. It's 1/4 or 1/5 as big as New York. Anyway, then it also, this is the first Chamber of Commerce in the United States, 1768, which is it was a very entrepreneurial city. We'll come back to what the characteristics were. During the American Revolution, I think we should say a word about this because of Fraunces Tavern, because of Lafayette, who's remembered here. We think of Boston, we think of the Paul Revere's ride of Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill. But the British, who looked at a map after they decided that we were going to have a war, and they said, who cares about Boston? It's in the middle of nowhere. It's in the right field of it. So the British ignored it. They could have come back any day they wanted, but they didn't. Where did they come? They looked at a map. Right here is where they come. Looked at the map and said, the key to the war is going to be actually the Hudson River, the North River. and the city and the great harbor. And that was the headquarters of the British Army and Navy for the entire war. This was it, because it also separated the two most important colonies at the time. Later, New York passed them both, but it was Massachusetts and Virginia. So that was it. So the British, so George Washington brings his army here to right here, War Manhattan. The British, next month, it will be 248 years, summer of August of 1776. What do you see in the harbor? 300 troop ships. There's never been such a fleet in this harbor ever again. 300 ships, not counting 30 men of war, which were the warships of the Royal Navy, which had 100 guns or could have 100 guns on them. We were talking at lunch. Those 30 men of the line, men of war, probably could outgun Napoleon's grand army that invaded Russia in 1812 with 500,000 men, because those ships carried those guns by the power of wind. What did Napoleon's army have to drag those heavy cannon hundreds and hundreds of miles, and there were no roads to Moscow. So no wonder Napoleon didn't make it. I mean, you can see the loss. And Napoleon, like Hitler, didn't successfully invade the Soviet Union, but the guns, stronger guns in New York Harbor. And so what does George Washington do? He's right here, I mean, a few hundred feet away, looking at the harbor, looking at those British ships. The real concern was Governor's Island, where we had an artillery position. And the idea was that artillery could help protect by getting the Royal Navy and infilade fire, in other words, from both sides. And so we knew that our guns on Governor's Island were important. The problem was, if the British, because the British didn't move their army, those 30,000 soldiers or so, to Brooklyn, South Brooklyn, and move north toward what's now more or less Greenwood Cemetery, that area going across. We think of it there. And he had to risk it. Do I move my army across the East River? Because they could potentially be cut off by those British warships and the war would be over. Washington does risk it. The Continental Army moves to Brooklyn, where biggest battle of the American Revolution. Why has nobody ever heard of it? We've heard of Washington crossing the Delaware on his way to sneak up on the British in Princeton. British thought that was chicken shit. Gentlemen don't do that. You don't fight at night and you don't slip up on people. But we celebrate that, but we've forgotten a much, much bigger battle. Because what happened? The American soldiers, essentially not a Maryland regiment, which had a great stand at the Stone House in Brooklyn, but the army generally ran in front of the British. We've learned in school that American soldiers were creative and we hid behind rocks and trees and stupid British marched forward. That's really not what happened. What happened is if you try to stand against the British, they're professional soldiers. They're probably the leading military country in the world, and a bunch of ragtag shopkeepers and farmers aren't going to stop them, and they didn't. They have a series of, by the way, the Great Escape, right here. The war should have been over because they had the American army trapped in Brooklyn Heights. But the Admiral Howe and General Howe were brothers, and somehow they didn't send just 2 of their warships into the East River to stop, but they didn't. Accidents of history. The American army evacuates more or less under the Brooklyn Bridge. Brooklyn Bridge was not there. Under cover of darkness and at night, they row each other, they row across the river. David McCullough talks about this in his great book, 1776. And even though a cannon goes off accidentally to wake the British up, anyway, the British don't do anything. The American army escapes to fight another day, but they fight a little bit in New York. We don't have to go into different things near Northern Central Park, near Columbia, on the White Plains. Basically, we lose everything. Not, there's minor exceptions. But I think George Washington, if you've ever been to the Morris Jumel Mansion in Manhattan, at about 163rd, 4th, and really in the East River, overlooking what used to be the Polo Grounds, where Willie Mays made the greatest catch in American history, because it was a shoebox. That's what the Polo Grounds was. It was shaped just like a shoebox. So it means right in left field or nowhere, but dead away center field is forever. And that's where Willie Mays played. And Vic Wertz hit this ball, knocked the cover off the ball. And Willie Mays, who was probably as great a center fielder as ever lived, ran as hard as he could. He knew he wasn't going to get killed. If you tried that now, you'd be killed because you'd hit a wall. But he knew how deep dead away center field was in the Polo Grounds. Stuck out his glove, his hat falls off, ball falls in it. It's still regarded as the greatest catch in American history, and it always will be, because nobody else is ever going to build a baseball stadium that looks like a shoebox.
Yeah.
But even what's more important there is that the Morris Jumel Mansion overlooks that spot. And George Washington, for 6 weeks, is there. His army is getting kicked around by the British. He's staring at the ceiling, wondering. And by the way, not with anybody in bed with him. No scandals attached to it. Staring at the ceiling. It's the first octagon in the United States, 8-sided room. And I think he stared at the ceiling, wondering, what am I going to do? I cannot fight the British Army. I can run to Ohio, where nobody's ever heard of me, and maybe I'll live a long life. Or I can, if he surrendered, he'd probably be executed. What he decides is, and this is not popular to say, he'll run and hide. He won't fight the British. It's exactly the strategy that Ho Chi Minh uses against the United States in the Vietnam War. We cannot fight the strongest military power in the world. What can we do? Because there's a battalion is the size of a unit in the army that's got fewer than 1,000 people. If even a battalion of Viet Cong or North Vietnamese had ever appeared in Vietnam, they would have been eliminated by American air power. They had no chance. They could only slip up at night or in small groups. They couldn't. And that's what happened. George Washington realized he couldn't fight the British Army. So he's got to protect the American army, stay in the field. Sooner or later, this great military superpower will get tired of it. That's what happened. One exception, Saratoga, upstate New York, the British Army gets away from its base and gets surrounded by the Americans and loses. It's an important battle. And at Yorktown, where they surrendered, where they joined with the French, and the French help us with their army and their navy, because the Royal Navy, which was stronger, happened to be somewhere else. And they surrendered. Other than that, George Washington keeps his army in the field. And what happens? What happens? British surrender at Yorktown, and the British say, to hell with it. Just like we said in Vietnam. Does it end? America reaches its strongest position vis-a-vis the world after we supposedly lose, if that's what you want to call it, in Vietnam. And the British Empire never surpassed what it became after it lost the American colonies. So both times the superpower was defeated by a small revolutionary group. And we need to know the Great Escape. And it was right here in this, within 1,000 feet of here. But history continues here. What's important about this place and this area and this square mile? History is not just some date in the past that we can celebrate or commemorate. It's everything. Think of it here. In 1792, just down the street, under a buttonwood tree, the New York Stock Exchange is founded in 1792. It becomes the world's dominant financial center. Still is. And probably because London's got problems, Hong Kong got problems. It doesn't even have a challenger right now. Near here, the Blackball line, regularly scheduled packet service. What does that mean? It means if you want to fly to Jacksonville, Florida, or Austin, Texas, you can look it up on the internet now, and they'll say a plane's leaving LaGuardia or JFK or somewhere, 4 o'clock this afternoon. That doesn't mean that they will fly because the pilot's not sick or because they've decided not enough people on the plane, it's not worth it to fly. They will fly when they say they'll fly. It's not perfect, but it's close. Black Ball Line, 1818, January. Sailing ship with a big black ball on it. From right here, right down the street on the harbor, South Street. Because before that, if you had wanted to ship something to Liverpool or wherever in England, and there was a captain there on a ship, and you'd say, you want to ship this load of pelts or whatever, you'd say, okay, we'll take it. When are you leaving? He'd say, well, when do you need me to go? And he would say, whatever you wanted him to hear. But he didn't mean it. He meant, I'm going to go when I've had enough wine, women, and song. I'm going to go when I can round up a crew. I'm going to go when my hold is full. I'm not going out in the North Atlantic, which is wild, with half a cargo. And I'm not going to go unless the weather is nice. So they went in a snowstorm in 1818. That's a huge managerial innovation here in New York, here in Lower Manhattan. New York would have become the greatest harbor in the world anyway, but that hurries it up. Why do the Irish come to New York? Nobody gives a damn where poor Irish want to go. But what about the Jews who are escaping the pogroms in Russia? And they're going to places like Kiel and Humber. Nobody asks them where they want to go. The ship's going to New York. That's important. New York becomes the leading seaport in the world by the Civil War, right after the Civil War. It has more international traffic than all other American ports put together. Go to Ellis Island and look at the chart, and it'll show people coming into Ellis Island. That chart goes up to here. Then they'll have Baltimore, Philadelphia, New Orleans, way down here on the bottom. All together, not even making up 10%. That's a huge innovation that's right here in the neighborhood. I'll try to get a little bit quicker. Public transportation starts down here. Public transportation means what? It used to be, it was just a wagon with wooden wheels. But what was new about it, Julius Caesar could have ridden around in that. What was new about this New York innovation? Technically, it started in France, but the innovation was really in New York. Schedule, it's going to run whether the driver is sick or whatever. We're going to run. That's the schedule. So if you wait at this stop, and it's going to stop here, and you're going to know where it's going. It's not going to go because I've decided I'm sick of this route. I want to go a different way. Or it's going to cost you a set amount. There were taxis, and you could have hailed one, but it'd be like today. You pay whatever you want to pay, but it's not a set low fee. That's New York. Anyway, I'll go there. Then ferries to Brooklyn. That's one of the first. Brooklyn's the first suburb. The Great Fire of 1835. There was another fire in 1776, which we probably set, we're not sure. Nathan Hill was executed for it. 1835 is the big fire. And I'll make another crazy statement. There's never been a fire in New York since 1835. A big fire. There were times when Baltimore burned down, San Francisco burned down, Boston burned down, Chicago. There's never been a fire. The New York Fire Department didn't exist until 1865. Never been a fire they couldn't put out quickly. Now, I know the World Trade Centers. That's really not a fire. That's an airplane crash with thousands of gallons of jet fuel. Then there's the Croton Aqueduct, the greatest water system in the world that feeds down here. There's 5 Points, which is really just on the other side of City Hall. Gangs of New York was a movie made about that. There's the Brooklyn Bridge, considered the 8th wonder of the world when it's built. That's kind of on the edge of right here, what I'm talking about. There's Ellis Island, right here in the harbor, which is the great immigration receiving station. There's the 1898 consolidation of the city into 5 boroughs, celebration of City Hall, not far from here. And that creates at once the 2nd largest city in the world after London. Think of it. In 1800, this is a relatively small place. In 1900, it's the great world city on the make. 1916 zoning. Zoning starts where? Right down the street, right across, really right across from the federal hall. On Wall Street, Broad Street, really right there. That's zoning. Zoning, it tells you what you can do with your land. That's a new concept in the United States. There was a fire in the Equitable building in 1913. They built up a new building and straight up. You know how narrow those streets are down here? What about Pearl Street? It's pretty narrow, isn't it? Well, they thought if we don't have zoning, buildings will all go up to the sky 50 stories and more. The sun will only hit the street at high noon and everybody will suffer. So that's here in the city. New York said 1917, New York Stock Exchange, New York becomes the financial center of the world because London can no longer finance World War I. Isn't this interesting? The World Depression in 1929, 1933. Where does it start? In the New York Stock Exchange, right down the street from us, Broad and Wall. That tells you how important New York had become in the world. That's absolutely wonderful. And then skyscrapers. Chicago argues that it's the first skyscraper, and architectural historians argue about it a little bit, but there can be no argument that New York is where they find full expression quickly. And so this is the real home of the skyscraper. And certainly about the 19-teens and 1920s and 30s, this is what's happening. And World War II, I'm aware of the time, busiest harbor in the world. Sometimes it'd be 400 ships loading, unloading here. This was the port of embarkation, not a port of embarkation. So if you were going to fight the Nazis in North Africa or Italy or France or Germany, you're going to get on a boat in New York, the port of embarkation. And the convoys would line up because they're not a convoy every day, but you'd want to get 50, 60, 70 ships all lined up, and they would line up in the Hudson River, North River, if you please, all the way to the George Washington Bridge. So the soldiers had to get on those ships and then sit on the ships for a week or more, waiting to leave. And then one day you'd wake up and they're all gone. Under cover of darkness and with all their lights off, they would slip out into the North Atlantic. The convoy would be about the size of Manhattan, and there'd be destroyers in the front, on both sides and in the rear, and maybe an American cruiser in case a larger German ship appeared. And that's how you got to Europe. Most soldiers who got on don't really remember it because they were worried. They tried to be brave, but they were scared, as they should have been. And then, by the way, the convoy operations were Lower Manhattan, Broadway, really near where the Cunard line is, White Star line is, the Titanic, right on Lower Broadway. Then we don't want to forget the bad news. In 1975, roughly, the city hits bottom. Not just financially, although that's one of them. I mean, essentially the city government was paying normal operating expenses with borrowed money. You're not supposed to do that in your household. It's all right to borrow money to buy a house, to buy a car, maybe even if necessary, buy a refrigerator, but not to pay for groceries. And that's what the city was doing. Borrowing money to pay the police. That's a no-no financially. And finally, the Wall Street blew the alarm, and we didn't technically go bankrupt. There are a lot of heroes there. By the way, I'm writing a book on New York since World War II. We could talk a lot about that. And the city comes back. That's the really difference. If you think about it, every single Northeastern or Midwestern big city, possibly, except in Columbus, Ohio, maybe Minneapolis, but not really. Every one has fewer people in 2020 than it did in 1950. No exception. Washington's going down lately. But anyway, New York is the exception. What happened in New York to make the city turn around from despair and bankruptcy and everything else to take off? And so I'm not going to talk about it now, but trust me, it took off. after 1975. I'd give Ed Koch a lot of credit, but in any case, Wall Street, whoever heard of credit default swaps and all these things, when it was the financial center of the world in 1945, there were only 10,000 people working on Wall Street. By 1990s, there were 100,000 and more. So that business exploded. And then in 2001, there's the World Trade Center. I won't go into that. When I was head of the New York Historical Society, we collected a lot of stuff. Barbara was with me, and we were behind St. Paul's Chapel and the cemetery. The dust was to your knees, but I could get in it because I was president of the Historical Society. And anyway, we saw something in a tree, and I was a good bit younger then and more athletic, and I climbed the tree and got this ugly looking thing down. And Barbara said, "That's a window blind." It didn't look like a window blind. It looked like some kind of Calder sculpture. Anyway, that's one of the few things that's from the world, because it fell straight down. It destroyed everything. Every computer, every desk, every picture, everything was destroyed in that. We've got a little bit of it. And predictions were common. The city's doomed. There was a fellow professor of urban planning at Columbia who thought this is the end of cities. Who's ever going to want to go into a tall building again or go into a dark subway? You know what? The city boomed after 2001. It really did. Skyscrapers everywhere. We don't have to talk about that. But what I would say, and I'll just wind up with this, is it seems to me that people ask me all the time, or I'll tell you, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm a historian, not a futurist. I will say that a lot of futurists got it wrong. You know, John Naisbitt, and Alvin Toffler, and people like that predicted in the 90s that everybody's going to move to their separate mountaintop. People don't want to live in their separate. It sounds good, but they don't. And even though lots of New Yorkers I know are moving to Florida or other places for tax reasons, young people, you may have seen the statistic. This is where young people want, even the techies, more than San Francisco. New York is the #1 destination. Young people want to go where they can eat at outdoor restaurants and see potential romantic partners or whatever, or have the chance to really succeed in business and stuff like that. New York seems to offer that. But what I want to say in conclusion is that what has New York always had, including down here, especially down here? Density. I'll make another outrageous statement. Chicago, which I love, is closer to being a farm than it is New York City. Its density is less than half that of New York City. And I'm talking about the whole city. I'm not talking about Manhattan. Then we'd be talking about 1/5 the size of Manhattan. But it's also got toleration. We owe the Dutch a lot because, you know, I know there were slaveholders and I know they didn't like Catholics and there were several things. But basically considering that's like call Abraham Lincoln a racist. Well, he was technically, but for his time, he was a pretty good guy, more than a good guy. Well, so were the Dutch. And they didn't care. They didn't care what your religion was or your sex. And let's say that I don't like people with purple hair. I don't even like women. I don't like people of different colors. But I'm selling hot dogs and it's hot today. And I'm selling hot dogs and I'm sweating. And you've got your money on the counter. Do I care what your religion is? Or I want your money. And the Dutch were here. This is important to remember. The Dutch came to make money. We associate greed with something bad, but there's something wonderful about greed, which is, I don't care who you are. I'll judge everybody the same. Can you pay for the hot dog? That's what's important. Boston was different. Anne Hutchinson, for whom the Hutchinson River Parkway is named in Westchester, was chased out of Boston because she disagreed with something called the halfway covenant, which doesn't need to concern us here. But they had a trial in Boston in which they said, you're guilty, get out of town. And anybody who believes like you, the Dutch frankly didn't give a damn what she thought. And that was important. So toleration. Diversity, because they were tolerant, they didn't really care what language you spoke or anything else, just do business as long as they don't bother you. And I know there are caveats here, so I'm not saying they were all perfect. Of course they weren't. And aspiration. New York has always celebrated aspiration. achievement. People come to New York not because they think it's going to be quiet or pleasant or sweet, although I think it is a lot of those things, but nevertheless, that's not the image. They come here because they want to, they think they're the best oboe player in the world or the best chess player. Where else would you have people who play chess 18 hours a day? They don't care about money. They don't care about sex. They don't care about anything. We care about chess. And they do it. And you don't want to play with them either, by the way. But anyway, but in this city, you can find other people, lots of other people who feel exactly like you do, enjoying the Manhattan Chess Club or different things like that. And to appreciate aspiration, I taught in Australia for a while. And Australia is a great place. But it's very egalitarian. They have a term in Australia called a tall poppy. The tall poppy means you're taller than the other poppies. And they mean that pejoratively. You think you're better than your mates? In America, that's what it's all about. Try to become Musk or Bill Gates or whomever. And now let me just say, I think because of all these things and because of what happened here, this is the greatest city in the world. Thank you for supporting the Fraunces Tavern, the Lower Manhattan Historical Society, the 400th anniversary and the upcoming 250th anniversary. And there are others. There's the anniversary of the abolition of slavery in 1827. There's the fire department sacrifice. 343 firemen were killed at the World Trade Center. Not one of them did what I probably would have done. Looked at the color of this book and said, you're not paying me enough to do this. I quit right now. None of them quit. 343 more firemen than ever have been killed in the history of the world. Not in the firebombing of Hamburg or Tokyo, did not happen. They did it at the World Trade Center. But anyway, let me end with to kind of sum up New York. I know it's not just Lower Manhattan, but it's all of the place, because it kind of sums up why we're here to commemorate and celebrate his wonderful, I think, achievements. It's from E.B. White, who was the guy who wrote a book called The Elements of Style, which is how do you write a paragraph and make it interesting with powerful verbs and get rid of passive stuff and don't repeat yourself. He also wrote for The New Yorker. He also wrote children's books, and he was talented. I did this enormous encyclopedia, as big as 20 books. It weighs 10 pounds. Bestseller, even though it was that big. But 800 people wrote it, and I just got credit for it all, which Barbara says I'm good at. But anyway, this book, this little tiny book, which you can read in 20 minutes, catches New York probably better than I did in my giant book. He says, New York blends the gift of privacy with the excitement of participation. And better than most dense communities, it succeeds in insulating the individual, if he wants it, and almost everybody wants or needs it, against all enormous and violent and wonderful events that are taking place every minute. New York is peculiarly constructed to absorb almost anything that comes along, whether a 1,000-foot ocean liner out of the east or a 20,000-man convention out of the west, without inflicting the event on its inhabitants, so that every event is in a sense optional, and the inhabitant is in the happy position of being able to choose his spectacle and so conserve his soul. Thank you very much. I've said a lot of things that probably will aggravate you or you want to add to, and I think that we're going to have questions at the end. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, it's better than any football coach in terms of a pep talk. If I had any doubts about New York, they're gone. Anyway, thank you very much, Professor Jackson. Next, I want to call on Pauline Toole, who is the Commissioner of the Department of Records and Information, formerly known as the New York City Archives, who's going to tell us about the upcoming anniversaries. Pauline?
Thank you. So good afternoon. Yeah, that's right. I'm Justin. Are you guys awake, man? Good afternoon and happy Independence Day. Since all of you are here on what is a fairly nice New York day, I have to imagine that you all like history. Many places have interesting stories about the residents, religion, art, music, architecture, geography, the built city, personalities, and so much more. Several cities, Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, promote their heritage as founding cities of this country. New York can make that claim as well. But New York is different. Unlike the rest of these other East Coast founding cities, our city encompasses all of the history of the United States, all 248 years of it and before, not just the beginning of the country. And at the New York City Municipal Archives, we've got the records. This year, the Dutch consulate has launched Future 400 to commemorate the first colonial settlements and the bedrock principles that have become embedded in the city structure. The freedom to practice religion, the right of city citizenship granted to people domiciled within its premises, regardless of religion or gender, and eventually race. These records are in our archives. Next year, we will mark the 400th anniversary of city government, based on the first documented official residing in Manhattan. We also will mark the opening of the Erie Canal, when Governor DeWitt Clinton poured water from Lake Erie into the Atlantic, arguably the development that helped make New York the preeminent port and commercial center of the country and the world. We didn't collaborate, Professor and I, but we're on the same track. In 2026, we will celebrate the semi-quincentennial of the founding of the United States of America. Unfortunately, there wasn't a functioning city government between May of 1776 and February of 1784, the Revolutionary War period, so we don't have the records. But from February 1784 to the present, we've got the records, including an interesting 1786 New York City Council Committee report on plans to celebrate Independence Day. Let me quote. At sunrise, the day be announced by a display of colors, a discharge of 13 cannon, and ringing of all the public bells for 1 hour. That at 12 o'clock there be a procession of this board and other public officers and citizens from the City Hall down Broad Street through Queen Street to the residence of their excellencies, the governor and the president of the United States, because New York was the first capital of the country. And thence by way of Beekman Street to the City Tavern, where our collation be provided. And I gotta say, that sounds a little bit about along the lines of what you all organized today. So, you know, it's a through line from 1784 to the present. As we prepare for these commemorations of important milestones, I encourage all of you who like history to dig in. Do a little research about where you live and who preceded you in those locations. Learn about how concern for public health drove the development of this city, including the creation of its famous water system. Explore how immigration helped New York grow from a population of 96,000 in 1810 to more than 3.4 million by 1900, making it the largest city in the country, and everything those immigrants brought with them. The records do not simply document the glory days. They reflect distrust, bigotry, injustice, as well as the creation of important institutions that serve the public and like efforts to reduce poverty, expand education, and create opportunity for all. So as we gear up for these wonderful commemorations that are going to explore the positives and the negatives and help put together a story that's more complete about the history of our city and our country. I encourage you to visit the New York City Municipal Archives in person at 31 Chambers or online at nyc.gov/records. You won't regret it. Thank you and happy Independence Day.
We are present today in the oldest building in Manhattan. And to tell you something of the history of this building, I'm going to call on Scott Dwyer, who is the Executive Director, Fraunces Tavern Museum and the Sons of the Revolution. Scott?
Thanks, Ambrose. Just give me a second. Gonna update our little program here so we can all see everything. Here we go. Again, welcome everybody to Fraunces Tavern and Fraunces Tavern Museum. As has been said, you are standing in the oldest building in Manhattan, still here. 1719, the structure was built. And as we've also talked about, this is the nexus of revolutionary activity in New York City, but it began as the private home of a loyalist family. The Delancey's built this in 1719 as a private home, but actually never lived here because as it continues to do today, the city began changing very quickly. And what was bucolic, well, not bucolic, that's probably an overstatement, but what was a quiet area when the Delancey's built the home began to change, began to become commercialized, and they did not stay here, and the city developed around the building, and it took on a number of different uses. It was a dance hall, it was an area for commercial activity for all the shipping and businesses happening at the port. And by 1759, the Delancey's, one of the Delancey's, the son of the original owner, Stephen, bought the property and began his business here. And strangely enough, a couple decades later, Oliver, Stephen's son, and his grandson actually engaged in activities here that would put the tavern on the map yet again as a Revolutionary War activity. And we'll talk about that a little later. But we all are here because in 1762, the tavern was purchased by Samuel Fraunces, the tavern's namesake. Samuel came from parts unknown, but established himself very quickly here in the city as a person to know and to know very many people, many patriots who were here, and using the tavern as a meeting place to talk about revolution, because in the 1760s, that's when revolution is being discussed. Taxes are being imposed, people are protesting in the streets all around here in this 1 square mile, which was pretty much the city at that point. And we had lots of activities going on here. First and foremost, the New York City chapter of the Sons of Liberty established themselves and often met here in secret to talk about war, to talk about revolution, what was happening, what needed to happen. And then fast forward to the 1770s, where things are squarely certainly beginning, and we have all the people that you know coming through the tavern. So whether it's Paul Revere coming here to dine with the Sons of Liberty, whether it's Samuel Adams, John Hancock, John Lamb, everybody is coming through the tavern to meet, to talk, to plan, and eventually to declare revolution. We have so many records around you, and Seth will talk about that, how they were used, how they were described, how they were announced here in the city. But as we all know, the city fell very early in the war to the British. And so you fast forward a couple years after 1776, the Battle on Long Island, and you have activity that is still going on at the tavern. So you have Fraunces, who tries to escape along with many patriots, but is captured and brought back. And he is cooking in his own tavern, which is being taken over by the British through the war effort. So he's using that opportunity, though, to listen, to record, to pass on information where he can to the British forces. And after the war is won and fought, he is awarded for that effort in a self-confessed diatribe of his service to the war effort, whether it was passing money, passing food to the prison ships that were just off site in Manhattan's waters. But that is when we have the story of the tavern really taking shape. Many people know all of the activities that happened right at the end of the war. So 1783, we have Evacuation Day, we have the farewell, which I'll talk about, but that was the end of the war. If you recall, war was won in 1781 with the siege of Yorktown, the surrender at Yorktown, but you still had 2 years of people, other battles, other plans, other ways to figure out how are we exiting this country that we've been at war with for so long. New York City was the capital that was the last city taken over or occupied by the British. It was also the city where people were coming to leave. All the loyalists who had either been with the British from the beginning or had gone over to the British side were coming to New York to leave aboard all of the British ships that were leaving for other colonies, other British colonies. What you had and that group of loyalists coming to the city or who were already here were a number of Black loyalists who had either become free and been with the British, or through either escaping slavery in other colonies, had come to New York, oftentimes with a certificate, a piece of paper saying that they had crossed British lines or had joined British forces. And because of several edicts and proclamations over the course of the war, had that freedom in hand. But you, in a contradictory situation, to end the war, you had a proclamation also written at the end of the war, which had a number of stipulations in it. And one of those stipulations directly said that British forces, British loyalists could not exit the country with property that was attributed to Americans. Unfortunately, at that time, property also included enslaved individuals. So you had a document that was part of the peace treaty with the British saying one thing, and you had activities on the ground saying another, because all of these Black loyalists and all the loyalists were here in the city with certificates at hand, expecting to board a British ship, and suddenly a document that was done by individuals abroad and here in the US was contradicting that. So you had generals meeting in a room to figure out what to do in this situation, because if you simply ignored what was on a piece of paper, you could reignite the war effort. If you went completely in the other direction, you could also reignite the war effort because of what was going on the ground. So the British and American forces, led by Washington and Sir Guy Carleton, created a situation where British and American representatives would establish a commission to hear cases where you had Black loyalists demanding freedom, demanding to board ships, and you had other individuals who were making a claim to them to pull them from those ships and keep them here in America. So you had a number of cases here that happened right here at the tavern where those two sides were coming together to create history, to create justice and liberty for the people involved. We had a number of cases here. Some people retained those freedoms and boarded those British ships as they intended. Some people did not and had to stay behind. And other people, we don't have a clear indication because the case was moved up the chain, and we're still looking to determine where those individuals ended up. But in the totality of those events, the cases that happened here in the tavern were a fraction of the over 3,000 people, Black loyalists, who boarded ships to parts other places around the world, namely Nova Scotia, Canada, which was a British territory where a number of people left to establish their own city, their own place to continue their lives abroad. So that was happening here in the tavern between April and November of 1783, again, as loyalist forces were leaving the city and trying to peacefully exit a war-torn, pretty much destroyed city after the war in as orderly a fashion as possible. And that was really the key part of 1783 when we're talking about periods of the tavern's history and what was going on in New York City. Of course, at the end of 1783, we have, just to talk about a couple of documents here, the title of today's event and our ongoing event here is It Happened Here. And we know what happened here because of documents and things in our past, things that have been recorded. So we have edicts here by, again, a Delancey family member talking about the commission meeting at Fraunces Tavern. We have records in the Book of Negroes, which was a list of all people who boarded those ships to leave the country, talking about the location being Fraunces Tavern. So we know what happened here because of the documentation, because of the primary sources. And we look to continue to establish, the tavern's place in that history, those cases. The exhibition is here in the Flag Gallery and will be moving to a larger space just across the way at the end of the year. So we're very fortunate to have that here, have that history, and talk about it in a meaningful way. And again, this is more documentation about the first cases that were here, and you can see those in full blown up glory around the corner to read that documentation more closely as to the individuals involved in these cases and the certificates that were given to them to establish their freedom, establish their ability to leave the city. So again, we're talking now at the 1783 is coming to a close. Evacuation day is upon us. The British are leaving the country for the very last time as a force that had been defeated. So we have Mark Washington and Governor Clinton marching down Broadway with the officers involved in the war effort to celebrate the British as they are marching also away from the city, boarding their ships. And celebrations abound. We are one of the centers of those celebrations. Governor Clinton hosts a dinner, which we say dinner, but we don't have a lot of documentation. We have a lot of drinking receipts from that event, but we do see a lot of celebration because the war is now ended. The British have evacuated. So Governor Clinton and Washington are celebrating here in the tavern with 13 famous toasts, which are documented again in the city's newspapers the next day. Sons of the Revolution no longer operate the tavern. Descendants of those Revolutionary War soldiers are still celebrating that evacuation day dinner and that event by toasting those same toasts that were given that day. You can see that paper and those toasts again listed in our McEntee Gallery across the way. So again, lots of interesting toasts here, highlighting countries, highlighting kings of France, and a lot of different remembrances and warnings and remembrances about the future as to what we fought for and what we need to think about in the future. So again, that is Evacuation Day here in November. And then it takes a little bit of time for the British ships to actually leave the port because they boarded, everybody's ready, but things need to take time. So once we finally know that the British ships are gone, Washington is back here at the tavern, again, taking his officers into the long room just downstairs here at the museum to celebrate and say goodbye to these men who he's fought so bravely with over the course of the war. This is a solemn occasion, bittersweet. Again, we're still celebrating, but we're saying goodbye to men we had fought so hardly with. And Washington is shaking everybody's hand. He is crying. Men who have fought so bravely are crying. It's a really amazing event. And again, documented. Well, we talk about celebrating, commemorating this event. We do also commemorate the Washington's farewell every year in our long room with a group of reenactors to talk about that event and showcase it. You can come visit us and attend the farewell on the 8th this year. It was the 4th, but we do it on a weekend, so it'll be the 8th. And you can meet Washington, talk to him as if he is Washington, ask him questions. And he will answer them because he knows everything, because he is Washington. So remember that when you're engaging with him. But we know this also happened again because we have the diary of Colonel Benjamin Talmadge through a descendant of his who was fortunate enough to contribute funds for us to purchase the tavern in 1904 and then restore it to its present day view, which is a recreation of the 1783 appearance of what it actually looked like based on documented research done by the architect of hire at the time to look at comparable buildings, look at the history of this building. But we know it happened here because Benjamin Talmadge wrote the memoir, left it to his family, and then was eventually gifted to us. And in that memoir are the pages that describe those events, the people that were here, and what was going on. And that diary is also in our McEntee gallery in one of our Tiffany cases. So please take a look at it before you leave today. It didn't stop there. So 1783, we have all these events of the end of the Revolution. And then the tavern is also the site of many other activities post-war. First and foremost, 1785 to 88, we are one of the first federal government office buildings hosting the Office of Foreign Affairs, U.S. Foreign Affairs. We have the Department of War, and we also have the Board of Treasury here. So these three departments, which are in our fledgling US government between the end of the war and the signing of the Constitution, are all trying to create the rules and govern a country that does not have a constitution yet. So all of these things are happening all at once. Treaties are being signed and reviewed. The government's debt is trying to be paid back, of which it is significant. And other events are happening to still broker peace and continue to defend the country that we have fought so hard to win over the course of these 3 years. That's all happening here at the same time. And then, of course, a little plug for us, the Sons of the Revolution are formed here in 1883 and eventually purchased the tavern and restore it in 1907. And it's reopened as a museum and tavern in 1907 on December 4th, the day of Washington's farewell. So we are very proud to continue the stewardship of this building and its history. If you are here now, you can go through our galleries and see all the wonderful exhibitions that we have on display, of which Peter Hein, our president, will be talking about our newest one momentarily. And if you either are online or back here visiting, you can come do many of our lectures and programs and speaker events. I'm going to give a plug for the next few that are coming up. First, on Fridays, all of July, we have a lot of family activities going on. Fun Day Fridays, colonial crafts for kids and their parents or guardians. On July 8th, we have a lecture event, When Washington Burned, the British Invasion of the Capitol and a Nation's Rise from the Ashes. That is actually a post-war lecture, more closer to the War of 1812, talking about the reignited tensions and war with the British and the effect on the country. And then we have another lecture, which also goes back to the Revolutionary War, but a different take, the environmental legacies, how the War of Independence affected the natural world in predicting and surprising ways. So a lecture on the environmental impact of the Revolutionary War, something that I don't think a lot of us have seen and know, and we're really happy to bring that to you. So again, all of our lectures are available virtually and in person here, and those are on our calendar on the museum's website. Thank you again so much for visiting with us, and we look forward to seeing you again. Have a good day.
What we know about history is based in large part on what people recorded and wrote down. You know, if it doesn't happen there, we may not know about it. A couple of examples that Scott just gave to you. We know about the 13 toasts because it was recorded in the newspaper. We know about Washington's farewell because Benjamin Talmadge recorded the event in his memoirs. Some memoirs are taken long after the fact. They're affected by memory But it's what we have. It's what history is based on. Our next presenter is someone who engages in the process, curating, collecting important historic documents with incredible passion. In the back, we have original copy, or one of the original copies, the Declaration of Independence, copy of George Washington's, the order book, where he directs that the Declaration be read. I understood for the first time, it was at 6 o'clock in the evening that he did this. Seth has brought us an incredible collection of documents, which I hope you have a chance to review, that he will describe and talk about a little bit, I suspect, which are awe-inspiring and eye-opening. Let me present Seth Keller.
My goal is to finish by 6, so we can. Let me just see how this works. Yeah, okay. So that's the Declaration of Independence that's on display in the back of the room that I invite you to look at afterwards. An original. People do ask me, well, where are the signatures? Or what do you mean an original? Isn't that in the National Archives? And this is actually more original. The so-called National Treasure document didn't exist in July of 1776. And if you see at the very top, in Congress, a declaration by the representatives. One of the reasons is that thanks to New York, on July 4th, it was not unanimous. And so all of the July 1776 printings that went out, and of course, there's no internet, there's no TV, there's no radio, and people aren't going to see this manuscript, especially a manuscript that doesn't exist yet. They have to read it in a newspaper or in broadside, single printed pages that were created to convey news, and with all the text on one side would make it easier to post for people to see it. But this is what a Declaration of Independence would have looked like in July of 1776. This one was printed in Boston. Last year, we displayed the New York printing here. And that's a good place for me to start with why I'm here. And I'm actually not going to talk about it happened here. I'm going to talk about why it still matters, these things that happened so long ago. And last year, I was asked to lend a copy of the Declaration of Independence to the Jefferson Memorial on July 4th. And their program idea was to read it all. Would you like me to do that? No. It's a bad idea for a couple of reasons. One is 7 minutes of grievances. We have our own grievances. And the other is that Native Americans are referred to as savages. But the worst part, I think, really is the best part. All men are created equal. Why is that the worst part? Well, because people today think of that and think, why do we care what these dead white slaveholding hypocrites say about liberty? And the reason that I know that we still care is because it doesn't stop with 1776. And so last year I solved the problem by pairing it with just one other document, by showing the Declaration of Independence with the document on your far right, which is Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech for the March on Washington in 1963. And Dr. King looks back at the founding, the Declaration and the Constitution, and talks about this creating a promissory note that all Americans would fall heir to. And I think if we look at American history gotta do it this way, in the context of where it's taken us, where these things have taken us, it becomes still alive. And it's not that they believed what they were writing. When they say all men are created equal, they're not delusional in thinking that that describes the society that they're living in. They're creating an aspiration that eventually we would get to. Okay, usually I like to just play with the documents, but we're trying to do it this way too. Okay, went back, good. Declaration. I will get there, okay. I will take issue with something that a couple of people have said before, that the Declaration of Independence was the creation of our country. At least John Hancock might have disagreed with that. When he sent the Declaration of Independence out with his cover letter to the 13 states, colony/states, sort of Schrodinger's cat of government at that moment, he sent it out with a cover letter saying that this is a ground and foundation of our future government. It is the greatest breakup note in history. It doesn't create a government. We have to fight for that. We have to try it out with the Articles of Confederation. That doesn't work. And then we get together for what I call the Declaration of Interdependence, the Constitution. And so to me, it doesn't make sense to still talk about the Declaration of Independence without talking about the Declaration of Interdependence too, because this is the foundation of the government that we needed to create at that time. And Pennsylvania packet, that's the other side of this. It's a 4-page document, so that's page 1. And on the right is blow up of the preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to create a more perfect union. This is really the first time in history that not only aren't they saying divine right of kings, but they're not just acknowledging that they're imperfect, but actually saying that they're creating a government that we have to work together to perfect. And it will always be a work in progress. Progress, forgot that word. And so here's the preamble. You can skip, if you want to understand the Constitution, read the preamble, skip all the articles. None of that really matters. It's an outline for government. But what we need to read today is the cover letter that George Washington sent with it from the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia to Congress in New York, the Confederation Congress. So despite what I said, I will do a little bit of it happened here. Because it wasn't from Philadelphia that the Constitution went out to all of the states to be ratified. It was from New York. After Congress read this and listened to it, I think the first proposal, okay. Well, let me tell you about the letter. We didn't show it entirely. But George Washington's letter to the Constitution, to the Confederation Congress, talked about the need for compromise. And also the most important thing that we should remember about liberty, and that is that you can't have liberty without giving up a share of liberty. And he says that very directly. And he also says that the hardest thing that government has to do is decide which liberties must be given up or surrendered in order to preserve which other liberties. And that actually depends on the situation, the circumstances. It's going to be different for one state than another. And the compromises that created this flawed but best they can do Constitution, they took into account the most important things for every state, and all the other states might have had to compromise on those issues. And then when it came their turn, all of the other states had the most important things taken care of, and the other states would compromise on that. And he says that in this very short cover letter. So I titled my speech, and it's the first time I've tried to do this. Last year, after the July 4th, I started calling the collection the Promise of Liberty collection. Just in the last couple of weeks, I started talking about this as authentic originalism, because we've been hearing about originalism that supposedly has the founders wanting us 250 years nearly in the future to interpret what they said based on exactly their words, based on exactly their time. And whatever the policy issues are, I won't get political about that, but that idea of originalism is dead wrong compared to what the founders were doing. The founders were creating a government to solve problems for them and to solve problems for us. And so to allow us to solve problems. And one way that I started to talk about this that makes a little sense, because my kids probably aren't that unusual. They think history is boring. History can be boring especially if it's about the past. So I don't like to talk about history for the past. I like to talk about history for the future or for now. And so instead of thinking about the Constitution as history, think about it as technology. Technology isn't just gadgets. Technology is a system of applying knowledge to solve problems. And if you want to know what the founders were thinking, that's what they were thinking. They were creating a system to apply knowledge to solve problems. And they were even creating a system for us to be able to change it as the circumstances changed. They were expecting us to. They knew that we would have our own new grievances, our own new problems that we would then have to solve. And so one of the big problems, obviously one of the biggest at the time, was slavery. And so today people can look back and discount what the founders said because of the hypocrisy of slavery when we're talking about liberty. But they were doing the best they can based on the circumstances that they had. And there were also compromises and this idea that slavery would end. So the Constitutional Convention actually set a time when 20 years from that date, they would allow the Congress at that time to stop the importation of new slaves. Thomas Jefferson happened to be president when that happened, and he didn't wait for the deadline. He made sure that it was passed the year before, so that on the very first day it was permissible, it went into effect that new slaves could not be imported into the country. Also, the one area that Congress, the Articles of Confederation Congress first, and then the Federal Congress next, had control over, total control, was the Northwest Territory. There, they didn't allow slavery, and the expectation of most of the founders would be that as the country grew, that slavery would not expand. And so it was a change actually pushed by the Southerners with the growing profit of slavery. And we talked about economy. That was one thing that changed actually, because in 1787, one reason the founders thought that slavery was dying out is they couldn't imagine that the cotton gin would be invented. So a couple of years later, the whole economics of slavery changed. And that made the forces that wanted to expand slavery much more powerful. So thankfully, in a way, it hadn't been invented before in 1787, and they weren't counting on that. But I have next to that document, Bill of Rights we'll skip, we talked about that enough. George Washington's Thanksgiving Proclamation. At the end of the first session of the first Federal Congress, on its last day, there was this great debate about whether Congress should ask George Washington to issue a Thanksgiving Proclamation. And it was a great debate because you had the too much religion, let's not do that. Not enough religion, let's do that. But my favorite is the anti-federalist who said, this is a new government. You can't ask the people to give thanks for it. We don't know if it works for the people yet. But it's here because if you want to know what the founders were really hoping to achieve with this government that they're creating, they talk about the ability to express and live out one's faith. They talk about the desire to increase education and science and commerce through this new government that basically is just founded and we're just trying out. And thankfully, we had some people like Hamilton who were not doctrinaire about anything, but who would try to do things, would fail, and would fix it as soon as possible. And that actually is one of the keynotes of this government. This is, I think, George Washington's greatest letter. I think the most important unheralded founding document, because I would call it George Washington's description of a nation built on inclusion. And let me read a little bit of it for you. It's his letter to the Newport congregation, the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island. And he doesn't go in 1789 as he does to other Northeastern states because Rhode Island hasn't approved the Constitution yet. But as soon as they do, after the end of the second session of the First Federal Congress, he and Thomas Jefferson and 3 others go from here to Newport and to be greeted by the town and welcome them into this new union. And as is typical, Washington is greeted by addresses from the governmental associations. From all the churches, they got together and gave one address. The Jewish congregation was not invited to participate with the other churches, but instead of being excluded, they were allowed the same opportunity that all the churches had, and they gave their own address. And the difference between an address and a letter is the address was given to George Washington in person, in public, at the same event, and then he was handed a copy of the letter. And so Washington's response was not actually given from Rhode Island, but once he returns to New York, and he signs and sends this letter. And let me read a little bit of it to you. It's a vision of inclusiveness, of religious freedom, of natural rights and security. And he uses what today we might call plagiarism, but actually he's calling back the best parts. It's a great habit of Washington's to call back the best parts of letters written to him. So Moses Seixas, who gave him the address, used the phrase "to bigotry no sanction." And George Washington used that, but expanded on it, as he often did, to create something even bigger. So Washington says, "All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support." And he does a couple of cool things, like he starts by talking about citizens, and then he expands it to talk about inhabitants. He starts by addressing the Jews and expands it to talk about the children of Abraham. And he ends with, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." That is the idea of a government that is creating true security for its people. And everything else, other than being a citizen who obeys the law, everything else is friction. All of these ideas about religion, about beliefs, about where you're from, about race, about gender, about sex, about any other thing, money, class, that's not part of that. It's, if you're in the United States and you obey the laws, you're a good citizen, then you deserve all of the protection of the United States. And that is why I call this an authentic originalism, because they're doing what they can. They're setting up this aspiration for the future, just like with the Declaration of Independence and Jefferson saying all men are created equal. Washington knows that this doesn't describe his reality. In fact, if you read the paragraph before that I skipped, he's fibbing a little bit, really. He's saying the United States has created this system that is worthy of copying, and we've done all these great things. He's writing this in 1790. None of that's happened yet, really. It's just he's expressed this idea. The actress Sophia Bush had a great answer when her friends, other liberal activists, make fun of her for loving the founding documents, the Declaration, the Constitution. Why do you, Sophia, care about what these dead white hypocritical men said about liberty? And her answer was, because their words knew before they did. And their words knew, and I know, short on time, I can talk about 2 or 3 other things, so I'll do this. But it's those words that people like Frederick Douglass in the document in the middle grabbed on. And in a moment even more troublesome than what we're going through today, there was this debate among people who said that the Constitution can never be, the Constitution is a document of slavery, and it can never be a constitution for a free people and a free government. And that was William Lloyd Garrison who took the burn it all down approach. We have to start from scratch. It was Frederick Douglass who led the opposition to that and who said, despite all of its flaws, this Declaration of Independence created an aspiration that was written out in the Constitution that created a government for a work in progress towards freedom, and that it would eventually be a document of freedom. And so don't burn it all down. Take the good parts that you have and run with that. Abraham Lincoln recognized it in one of his greatest speeches that isn't often talked about. He stops in Philadelphia on his way to assume the presidency. And just for context, he knows that he's already under death threat, assassination threat, and that's changing the whole trip to Washington. But it affects what he says, and so I don't mess up the paraphrasing. It's not the mere matter of the separation of the colonies from the motherland, the breakup note, but that sentiment in the Declaration of Independence, which gave liberty, not alone to the people of this country, but I hope to the world for all future time. It was that which gave promise that in due time, the weight would be lifted from the shoulders of all men. This is the sentiment embodied in that Declaration of Independence. And if he can't help save the nation based on that, he says, if this country cannot be saved without giving up that principle, I was about to say I would rather be assassinated on the spot than to surrender it. We have, we can't forget the women. So Declaration of Independence, bigotry, no sanction letter, they're not writing about women, but once you accept that women are human beings, then the inherent natural rights that are talked about in the Declaration or that are talked about in the bigotry, no sanction letter have to apply to women. And one of the first steps, though, is to get them involved in the political process. And there's always this threat to people who have entrenched power for any new group of people to get political power. And so they're fear-mongering and their women are gonna, wreck the country and all that. And here you see both the growth in politics and the growth in the nation as women start being involved politically. This way. I'm going to end with Martin Luther King's speech from the March on Washington, which this is a 3-page speech. If you come up and read it afterwards, you'll note that it doesn't have "I have a dream." Why not? Well, he was supposed to give a 4-minute speech. That's his 4-minute speech. He finished writing it about 2 a.m. It goes right downstairs to the press office for the March on Washington. They mimeograph it. That's one of the original mimeographs. There might have been 1,000 printed. There are fewer than 20 that survive. But that's the whole speech. And it's the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And he talks about the promise of liberty, that he refuses to believe that the vaults of opportunity in this nation are empty. He calls it a promissory note that we've defaulted on, but that we need to step forward and meet and to give the opportunity to create their own liberty to all people in America. And so he's reading the speech. Let me see if no. Right before the end, yeah, it's a different copy is shown here. So just as he's finishing the last paragraph, Mahalia Jackson calls out, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." And so for 8 minutes, he goes off script and extemporizes, and then he comes back and finishes with this great paragraph, which is exactly what he had planned to finish with before. And so probably as good a place as any for me to finish by saying that I think that Declaration of Independence, the founding documents, our whole history is important, not just because it's history, but because it has meaning to us today. And I'm hoping that in 2026, when we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, that we're looking forward as much as backwards, but that we're taking the best lessons that our founders, and I include Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass and Susan Anthony and Alice Paul as part of our founders. Just like if we talk about the Constitution, you can't have originalism by looking just at this, which is not our Constitution today. This is the Constitution of 1787. Our Constitution today includes the Bill of Rights, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the 19th Amendment giving the vote, the franchise to women, 14th Equal Protection Amendment. That is our Constitution today. And that's the result of the Declaration of Independence. And the promiseofliberty.org is a new website that I've started to put these documents up on. Eventually, soon, they'll have full images, descriptions and all that I invite people to download, share, print, use in schools, whatever. And we're just planning a national tour in 2026 with these original documents. So thank you for having me and thinking about history.
Well, speaking of national tours, there's a national tour now occurring to celebrate Marquis de Lafayette's return to the United States in 1824 and 1825 when he traveled throughout all of the states. We have a new exhibit here containing some of our treasures relating to the Marquis de Lafayette and describing his return. I want to present Peter Hine, who's the president of the Sons of the Revolution, which oversees Fraunces Tavern Museum. Peter.
So I'm going to, let me just, there we go. I'm going to speak about our most recent special exhibit, Lafayette, A Hero's Return. It commemorates the 200th anniversary of the Marquis de Lafayette's Grand Tour of the United States in 1824. The exhibit is in the back of the area that I'm pointing to. It's the Adeline Moses Loeb Gallery. If you haven't already seen it, please take time to see it before you leave today. If you're not here physically but participating virtually, please see it when you're next in the museum. The exhibit features many objects that are in our museum's collection. Most of the objects featured are in our collection. Several items have been borrowed specially for this exhibit. So back in 1824, President James Monroe invited Lafayette to return to America while the nation was preparing to celebrate its 50th anniversary. So we're preparing for 250, then they were preparing for 50. And Lafayette was the last living general from the Revolutionary War era when he came here for his grand tour in 1824. Because he was the last surviving general, I think is one reason that this tour attracted so much interest at the time. One of the objects that opens the exhibit is a castor plaster bust of the Marquis de Lafayette. And at the opening last month, we quite appropriately had to help us open the exhibit a French general, Brigadier General Vincent de Keitzbader, who was the head of the French defense mission to the United Nations, and his wife Helen, whose family had relations with her ancestors go back to those who dealt with André and Lafayette back at the time. But we were delighted to have General Vincent de Keitzbader here to participate in the opening, as well as to speak about the French role in the North American campaign. One of the key exhibits that's part of our collection is the sash that is believed to be the one tied around Lafayette's wound in the Battle of Brandywine. This was gifted to the museum almost just a few years after the museum was formed. So it was gifted in 1915. The textile mounting for this exhibit is courtesy of the Mary Washington Colonial Chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, with support from a National Society Daughters of the American Revolution program. Another featured object is two of Lafayette's flintlock pistols. They were produced in France in the 18th century, and they're believed to have been owned by Lafayette and actually used by him in the American Revolution. When you look at them, look up close, and you can see they definitely look like pistols that have actually been used in battle as opposed to simply decorative items. Lafayette, in addition to Brandywine and other battles thereafter, played a critical role in the Virginia campaign, keeping the British boxed up and kind of in check in Virginia until Rochambeau and Washington brought their larger armies down to Virginia. And this is another item from our collection, the Henry Hintermeister painting that shows General Washington huddled around a table planning the siege of the British Army at Yorktown. Lafayette is pictured on the right, just across from General Washington. Of course, when he came in 1824, Lafayette was a bit older than he was when he first came to America. He came to America in 1777 at the age of 19. So, and he was born in 1857, I believe. So just do the math in terms of his age in 1824. So this portrait of Lafayette is one which effectively became the definitive portrait of Lafayette in his latter years. And this was a portrait or taken from a portrait from 1822, just before he traveled here for his grand tour. The tour, of course, was very much celebrated. He arrived on August 15th. It was a Sunday, so they decided to have the ceremonial arrival the next day, Monday, August 16th, 1824. And this is an edition, a mock-up of the edition of the New York Evening Post that was published on August 16, 1824, that reported on Lafayette's arrival to New York and the events of August 16th to commemorate him. There were lots and lots of commemorative items that were prepared, I'm sure, for sale, among other things, in connection with this 1824 visit. We have some examples on display. You'll note in particular the ribbon on the left of the slide, and it has the legend. If you get up close to the original in the exhibit, you'll see it says the nation's guest. And so that was a little bit of a theme at the time, that Lafayette was the nation's guest, which indeed he was. Underscoring what a big deal Lafayette's return to America was, English potters created a whole series of different tableware items that featured Lafayette's likeness and, in many cases, scenes from stops on his tour to America. We have a number of examples on display, and it's something where, as you look at them closely, you'll see the different scenes of different places that he visited when he was in America. And here is another example, a blue Stratfordshire pitcher. And again, the phrase, the nation's guest, appears on the pitcher. Against one wall in the exhibit, you'll see a reproduction of a 1826 engraving that depicts Lafayette's landing at Castle Garden in New York on August 16, 1824. And Castle Garden is what was constructed as a fort to help defend New York Harbor in the War of 1812. Today it's known as Castle Clinton. Those of you who participated in this morning's Independence Day parade will well know Castle Clinton because that's where the flag raising occurred and that's where our parade began today. So many people were responsible for this exhibit. This slide credits a number of them. Scott Dwyer, Executive Director, Sons of the Revolution, the State of New York, Fraunces Tavern Museum. Lisa Goulet, the Fraunces Tavern Museum Collections Manager. There's an active Sons of the Revolution Museum and Art Committee. Ambrose Richardson, who has been speaking today, is one of the co-chairmen. Craig Weaver is the second. In addition, Craig Weaver and Renee Witterstatter made available some of the objects in the exhibit. Renee is also the curator of the George Washington in Comics and Popular Culture exhibit in the Messick Gallery next door, the Cloak Crusader exhibit. And if you haven't looked carefully at that exhibit, take the time to do that again before you leave today. So thank you very much. One final plug, a plug for Fraunces Tavern Museum. We'd be delighted for you to get on our mailing list. You can join the museum. We certainly appreciate any support that you might be willing to provide. Thank you.
You've probably all seen the painting, or copies of the painting of the statue of George III being torn down on July 9th. We know that the declaration was read at 6 o'clock at the Commons, which is now City Hall Park. But the next presentation, we're calling on Abby Suckle to tell us about what happened next.
Can you hear me? Is this, okay. I don't think I'm tall enough. Oh, is this better? Probably better. That's me. I know, I was younger then. Actually, if the button, oh, it pushed, okay. Okay, no, hang on.
We went to the same school. How to learn these things.
Is this the first? Okay. The reason I'm talking about the toppling of the statue of King George is when Seth said he was going to bring Washington's order book that was read and put it in the back of the room, I said, okay, here it is in the back. It's an old document. And the story is basically like true crime. So let me kind of introduce you. Part of our exercise with Culture Now, what we've been doing is trying to connect the dots, to connect the people, the places, the stories and events, and kind of not only make history come alive, but also talk about where to go from here and where the past has been. So these are the players that actually affect the story. We probably could have had more space and put more of them. So what I'm going to do is try to explain all the different people and all the different places and how this is part of, if you look around. The first thing is that there was a Parliament repeals the Stamp Act in 1765. And the New York Assembly was very thrilled. So they commissioned Tilden in Joseph, I cannot read this from here. They commissioned sculptures, two sculptures, one of William Pitt and one of King George to put in New York City. And it took a while. This was the sculptor. This is William Pitt. William Pitt is a claim to fame is that he actually gave a speech in Parliament to propose repealing the Stamp Act. So that was, the Stamp Act was wildly unpopular. So they thought that was worth a statue. The statue that Tilden is on the right is currently in the New York Historical Society. At the time it was installed, it was on Wall Street, probably pretty close to where City Hall was, which is a federal hall. although we're not sure. Now we get to King George III. This is his coronation portrait. And the second statue is a 4,000 pound and then some golden statue of King George. And he was dressed up in Roman garb with a crown on his head, and he was gold. He was actually a heavy statue, and they had his behind, which John Adams actually points out that he's facing the harbor. They decided that it probably wasn't safe to have the statue in Bowling Green without a big fence. So a fence was commissioned at pretty much the same price as the statue was. And the fence had gold crowns on top. And the fence, which you can still see at Bowling Green, is there. This is Washington's order book that he says that what happens is the Declaration of Independence gets approved, and then they have to get copies printed. So they Independence Committee goes to the local printer, copies are printed, and it's sent out to be read in all the colonies. So effectively by July 9th, that's really when it shows up in New York. Washington at the time, there wasn't a good place for him to stay. He was supposed to move to Richmond Hill, but he ends up on 1 Broadway in the Kennedy Mansion. The Kennedys evidently were a wealthy family, but he just got a title in England that he inherited, so he had to go home. And it was a large house with enough room for 6 staff who were working for Washington, and all the stables and everything else. So effectively at 1 Broadway, it was a couple blocks from here. The order gets written, whether or not someone actually read the Declaration at Fraunces, they may have, it wasn't very far. And then the largest place to actually do the reading happens to be the Fields, which is effectively the City Hall Park. So that's where the troops are amassed to have the reading. Now there's 2 kind of interesting guys. This is a guy named Captain Oliver Brown. He was a Boston, he was from Lexington, and when he was a teenager, his parents sent him to live with a relative in Boston, and he happens to witness the Tea Party. And he also goes back to Lexington, and he's on Lexington Green the day that the troops defending his militia, and he's probably about 19 or something like that. And he's part of the Lexington militia. So he's had not much military experience. The Sons of the Revolution happened to be led by this guy named Isaac Sears. Captain Brown, by the way, ends up living to be 95 years old. After the war, there's things written about him. He actually has a wife named Abigail and moves to West Virginia, and that seems to be where he's buried at the moment. Isaac Sears, Sons of Liberty, he has also an interesting career, becomes a privateer, quite wealthy, and he was at the Battle of Golden Hill. And so those are the 2 people that essentially cut the statue down. Now the statue happens to, this is our map from our website, kind of showing you Bowling Green on the historic map of that time. They cut the statue down, and they chop it up into pieces. So what do you do next? Well, the first thing they did, this is Ebenezer Hazard. He is the Postmaster General, and he's explaining to a letter to Horatio Gates, which is obviously posted online. But anyway, says that when it's cut up, it will become musket balls, and those musket balls will actually, hurt the troops of King George. So the problem is, how do you take the statue in bits and pieces and turn him into musket balls? Oliver Wolcott, who was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, had a foundry in Litchfield, Connecticut. Litchfield is not actually that close to Lower Manhattan, which requires that somehow you get all the bits and pieces up to Connecticut, which is 50 miles away. So some of it, they cut it up, they took it in boats. They also took, not everything arrived the same way, let's put it that way. This is Oliver Wolcott, and this is his I guess it's his residence in Litchfield. It isn't clear to me whether the foundry was in the residence or not, but at the scale of that time, it's very possible. Mary Ann is his daughter. Mary Ann is actually the one who was completely responsible for making the musket ball. She herself, there were 40-something thousand made. She did 10,000 herself, and her brother and her mother and some other people in the neighborhood and the ladies of Litchfield helped make musket balls. So that, however, doesn't count for all the weight in the statue. So there was an issue what to do with the head. The head of King George, with the Grecian crown and everything, gets cut up, and there's two places that there were a lot of loyalists, and there's essentially they got as far as some of the taverns, and the head is supposedly put on a spike, and it's stolen, and it's stolen by Captain John Montresor. This is his journal where he starts to write about what his description, which obviously I'm not going to read to you, but essentially what he does with the head, because he decides that it all should be buried and then sent back to England. And of all things, they want to send it to Lord Townshend, who, for those of you, if you didn't like the Stamp Act, you really wouldn't like the Townshend Acts, because there were 5 acts that were passed about a year later, which sort of started the Tea Party and everything else. So he thought it was perfect to send to Townshend, and it ends up going there. And this is Charles Townshend. And there's a picture of Boston Harbor. It's, actually, I liked it because it's Paul Revere's rendering, and this is Thomas Hutchison. For those of you who aren't that familiar with Thomas Hutchison, he was the British Governor General of Massachusetts. This is his house. It happened to be inconveniently located for the mobs after the Boston Tea Party. So they decided that the perfect thing to do was to actually ransack it. And they did a beautiful job of destroying the house, which among other things made him so upset that he essentially went back to England to try to get enough money to buy himself and get a new house and a better appointment and everything else. So he ends up at Townsend's complaining when the head shows up and the wife is there, because there's descriptions of the fact that he saw it and they were all complaining about, the Americans. And that's his journal where he describes the whole thing in London. I believe he ends up dying in London. But now this is the next person. I don't really understand how the base could have ended up first as the gravestone for a Captain John Smith, who I'm not exactly sure why. It lasted for about 15 years, and then for some reason it became the kitchen step to this house for the divorce house, which was in Newark of all places, until somehow a relative decided that the proper location for such a piece of marble would be the New York Historical Society. So it is somewhere in their archives at the moment. This is the tail, which has also found a way into the New York Historical Society right now. And then this is the Davis Swamp. Now, the Davis Swamp is in Wilton, Connecticut, which is not Litchfield. And it turns out there were a lot of loyalists there. And what they did is they took all the bits and pieces, evidently the exhausted people, soldiers and all, stayed at the taverns, and then the loyalists stole the bits and pieces. And for some reason they buried it in Litchfield, in Wilton in the Davis Swamp. So the reason that this is interesting is because there's a lot left there, and there have been all sorts of lawsuits about the bits and pieces that were published in the swamp. And this is an article from the New York Times discussing one of the lawsuits, which was, if you look at the date, in 1776. Or 1976, sorry about that. However, there's still more there. This is the arm, which was put up for auction in some year, not very long ago. And it isn't very clear why the arm suddenly reappeared and was up for auction, but there it was. I'm not sure what happened to it, and this is in Wilton, Connecticut, in the Wilton Historical Society, so that if you actually want to see a piece that wasn't turned into a musket ball, that's where it is. Now, if you want to see some that were, you can go to the Museum of the American Revolution, where they have 6 or 7 of them, which for some reason they got from the Battle of Monmouth. And they tested them, non-invasive, of course, as to whether they were really from the King George's statue and had the right amount of lead in them. And it turned out that possibly this was true. However, the Museum of the American Revolution, as you know, most of the historical museums are artifacts. So for some reason, they decided it would be a really good idea to have the statue remade in Brooklyn. So they did, and when they opened in their building, it's indeed still there, so you can go and be inspired by it. They were going to join us on the website today, but they're open and they're rather busy. So these are all the people that I have just kind of given you the 5 minutes about, and this is sort of all the connections. And you know, there's a lot of lead in Wilton, Connecticut, if you feel like digging, and there's all sorts of land ownership issues about the swamp and development that are actually kind of interesting to delve into should you be inspired. But hopefully what we're going to try to do next year, and the whole point of this, is to take all of this stuff, and if we can't tell one story, we'll tell a lot of stories, and talk about, you know, how you stand in a place, you look at it, everything happened here, and like you just don't see it. And maybe if we not only make it come alive, but also make it come alive in a way that's really engaging, you know. I mean, you know, I just say this because every time I go down past Maiden Lane and there's people looking for the room where it happened, and you know, Jefferson had rented a house he didn't even like. And they had a dinner, you know, the dinner table party bargain, where that was the capital of America was going to be Washington, D.C. And it's in the musical Hamilton, but yet you stand there and, you know, there's a sort of a sign, and that's what it is. And this is really what Lower Manhattan is about. So in a way, to just connect the dots is what hopefully we can come up with, and then tell everybody it really did happen here.
Victoria, did you want to do some Q&A or?
We have to do Q&A, and does anybody have any questions? We have a lot of people here who can answer things, and no more.
Good.
All right, go for it.
The Patriots, of course, talked about pledging their lives and the rest, and mention was made. Washington may have been hanged and caught, but September the 11th holds real significance also, because in 1776, the Lords Howe, 2 brothers, with John Adams, Ben Franklin, Rutledge, in his conference house. They said to us was, all could be forgiven if you come back and go back to the way you were before, which of course it's a really different approach to looking at in terms of mortal danger. The British seem to have been of mixed minds about it. I also just learned down here before that part of the reason why they agreed to withdraw following to end the war was the government fall. The government came in and that was over.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's a question. I think that's all true, but yeah, what you've said, yeah, the House were sympathetic to the American cause, and notwithstanding the Americans having declared independence, were adamant in taking that position. They weren't going to give it up, you know, simply as a result of a disastrous battle.
Yeah.
And we're willing to stick it out to the end. And yes, the government did fall, and the British decided that these North Americans are too much trouble. We're making more money in the West Indies And who knows what's gonna happen, they'll probably be back in the future sometime anyway, so, let's deal with that. And they were in an impossible situation with supply lines 3,000 miles away. The support was less than they thought. I think the estimates were about 40% favored the Patriots, 20% favored the Loyalists, and 40% waited to see how it turned out. So we know it's that situation, but yeah, I mean, it's wonderful stories. Didn't have to turn out that way, but it did. But another story. Anyway. Yeah, go ahead, yes. Okay,
I don't think it goes on Zoom if you don't have the mic.
okay, good. Okay.
This is just minutia question. Reading in some of the articles, what was the letter F substituted for S? What language is that from? Old English, Dutch? What is that? German?
You can answer, or it said, answer.
So I actually can answer without knowing the answer, but it's the long S, and it was pronounced as an S. It was read as an S. About 500 years before, that started as a style thing. And the best reason for it that I've ever heard is wrong. But the reason people thought of it is, oh, well, because of typesetting, when they started, with Gutenberg's press, and there might not have been enough S's or something like that. But that can't be true because it was also written in manuscript the same way. And there are particular rules where it is in the word and how it is. But it just was a style thing, and it ended up going away right around 1800, also for no particular reason. So it's just an S. And one way to tell is the F is crossed to the right and the long S is crossed to the left. So.
Do you have the microphone?
I speak so loudly, I'm sure no one cannot hear me. All right.
You won't hear it on Zoom.
All right, thank you very much. Oh, great. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. First of all, I just wanted to say that about that S thing and the F, you have that in German too. You have different styles of writing that were from another time. And speaking of German, I have a couple of things to say. It didn't come up here, but I work in tourism, travel, and I have a lot of German clients. And we always would hear this story about how German almost became the language of the United States. Have any of you heard this? Yeah, of course it isn't true. It's that there was so much German, there were so many Germans that they thought of translating, everything, but they never did. They never got to that. It came up in the early Congress. I just wanted to say that I watched last night, I don't know if any of you watched Lawrence O'Donnell, The Last Word, but you can Google it. He had a really good episode on sort of saying iconoclastic things, sort of things that were not your typical things about the 4th of July and independence. Unfortunately, I had just come back from the hospital and I was a little bit out of it, so I have to watch it again. But I highly recommend that everybody here Google it and watch that episode. And thank you again.
Yeah, I have a question, but first of all, it's clear you can't look at, if you look at 1776 through 1789 as a single envelope, and there's a process of forming a country. And the issue of thinking about these people and what they're doing, this notion of the future, is a very important one. I mean, Gouverneur Morris, for example, and his role in the writing of the preamble of the Constitution, and his role at the Constitutional Convention completely opposing slavery, calling for the abolition of slavery. I mean, I have a process here that involves all sorts of people. And I have a kind of a question. I mean, if when you bring up the King's speech, and it was properly pointed out, King speaks about a dream. It's not in his speech. He's speaking in the subjunctive. That is to say, in the same way that the Declaration or the preamble. These are documents for the future. Sure, these people are flawed. Of course they're flawed. But they're saying something that's going to be timeless. And they're looking for a nation that will exist in time. It's going to have imperfections. So I have a question, which is, why should anybody think that we should be defensive about what these people said, what they meant, and why they meant it? the fact that they were flawed just says something, I think, very beautiful about ourselves. What we may be able to do, because I think we're quite flawed as well. So I have that as a question.
I have no idea who should answer
I can
that.
answer.
Oh, you're gonna do.
Yeah, because, well, my answer is, relates to my reaction when I was asked to show the declaration last year. And it isn't really about me, but it's about how people in the audience are going to react, what my kids feel about it, what the general population feels about it. And we could be defensive. I'm actually trying to go on the offense in a way by talking about authentic originalism and taking the good parts. So this, one way to look at it is when the Confederate statues started coming down, people who weren't so much in favor of that, I think they all should come down. We're saying, but aren't they going to take George Washington and Thomas Jefferson next? They were slaveholders, too. But my answer is no, because the Confederate statues were all there to glorify slavery, to glorify treason, and to support the very worst things about those people. Whereas the monuments to Jefferson and Washington were all built to glorify the greatest things about those people, their aspirations for the future. So I don't know if that answers your question, but you can give my talk as well as I can, I think. So we got to sign you up to take it out.
I actually, Seth, just a slight clarification. There used to be a statue of Jefferson in the city council chambers. It was the maquette for the statue of Jefferson, which is actually in Congress. And the city council chamber when Jefferson is now at the Historical Society, which evidently is our attic. And the other is still in Congress.
Yeah, which I think that is a good solution also.
I'm not sure the same people made the solution. Yes, all right.
One comment, and that's Leon Higginbotham, who's a federal judge, wrote a book called A Question of Color. And he concluded that the drafters, the committee, when they said all men are created equal, really meant it. And if you look how it was composed, Roger Sherman was an abolitionist. Franklin became an abolitionist. Adams was. Robert Livingston talked the talk, didn't walk the walk. Jefferson sometimes talked the talk, didn't walk the walk. But I think the consensus of that committee was really they meant it. But people have, and of course, we had a great Civil War, as Lincoln said, because a lot of people said that was just wrong. It's wrong. However, we know how the Civil War turned out, and big part of our history. I don't see anything for us to apologize about it with regard to the founders. Thanks. Comment on that? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I wanted to respond a little bit as a Southerner. I grew up in Memphis. I think one of the great things about New York City is a Southern boy, a Southern cracker with a Southern accent can be president of the New York Historical Society. I could never have been president of the Charleston Historical Society, even the St. Louis Historical. Anyway, that's a different matter. But I think context matters. It's true that Abraham Lincoln said that if I could save the Union by freeing none of the slaves, I would do that, or if I could free all the slaves, or if I could free some of them but not others. So in a certain technical sense, he's a racist. But Abraham Lincoln is really the greatest American who ever lived. So, we have to be careful. But I think the Civil War, as a Southerner growing up and reading about Appomattox, it was hard to be against somebody like Grant, who said when they surrendered, he doesn't accept Lee's sword. He tells his men, just go home. Can you get better terms than that? We're not gonna put you in prison like we did Nazi soldiers for years. Go home. And and we've got to feed, they're hungry, feed them. And some of them have their own horses, do that. But I think that's important. And for the matter of generals, I think it's very tough. But in Memphis, there's a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was really a good general, probably maybe the best cavalry commander, maybe, of the Civil War, but a lousy human being who was a slave trader, who had something to do with the slaughter of Union troops at Fort Pickering, who was a founder of the Ku Klux Klan, versus Robert E. Lee, who technically was a traitor. He could have been executed, as George Washington could have been. But I think that we're probably dealing with that pretty well. But I think it's a good thing in the country that we usually exercise judgment and not just doing everything. I don't think there's an easy answer to it. Because I think there's a difference between Nathan Bedford Forrest and Robert E. Lee, even though both are technically traitors to the United States and could have been executed, but weren't.
We got a few more.
Yeah, I just,
Yeah, go ahead.
well, thank you for that. That was wonderful. I just have a little bit of clarification for Lieutenant Jackson. I had always learned or thought that the reason Washington got out of New York and that New York was such a stronghold during the American Revolutionary War was because of the Loyalist presence here in New York City. But from your talk, it seems that I'm wrong. So I was just wondering if you could clarify a little bit about a little bit his military genius in comparison to Vietnam.
Well, first of all, New York, the Hudson Valley. I'm sorry. The British decided, and George Washington decided that the Hudson Valley was the key to the American Revolution, really the Hudson River and the New York Harbor. And most of the war was fought in or around the Hudson Valley. They went to Philadelphia, went back and forth. But what I think is critical here is that George Washington had to be persuaded by the French commander-in-chief, I've forgotten his name. Rochambeau, that there was a chance. He knew that the British Army was moving south toward York, toward Virginia, and that the French Army and Navy, or at least parts of both, would be available to the Americans if he went south. Washington wasn't originally planning to go to Virginia. And Rochambeau had to convince him there's an opportunity here because the Royal Navy, which was the best Navy in the world, was going to be somewhere else. And that's really what happened. It was chance, and it worked. It was a gamble they took, and the gamble worked, and the British surrendered. And the British could have come back if they wanted. You know, when the British left, if they really had wanted to come back to New York and take it, they could have. But it was like we could have taken any place in Vietnam too. But it's not worth it. You know, we spent too much money and lost lives. And by the way, we lost more lives in the British prison ships in the harbor of New York than we lost in the entire war. And that's a story. Those people were true patriots. You know, not as Donald Trump says they were losers because they surrendered. They could have mostly, if they were willing to have joined the Royal Navy, escape from those prison ships, which were horrible, and they didn't do it. So, you know, I think we ought to spend a lot of time on who is a patriot and who isn't. But I think also for all of its flaws, and Lord knows we've got a lot, and race and riots, redlining and segregation, every kind of thing else, the story of the United States, we can still stand it up against anybody else. You know, who else? Is France or England or Germany going to elect a black president? I don't think anytime soon. So we've got a lot to apologize for, no question. But I think the wonderful thing about our history is that if we look at all of it, warts and all, it's still interesting, and still we've done a pretty good job.
To bring the past into the present, how did Washington finesse stepping down for another term as president?
Well, no, I think he pretty had enough after 2 terms of doing this. What was recognized as remarkable about Washington was that on 2 occasions, he was willing to relinquish power. And when the story is that was told that when George III heard that Washington was just going back to becoming a farmer in Virginia, such as he did, he described him as, then he's the greatest man in the world, that somebody who had all the power, all the might at that point at that time to go and resign his commission and walk away. It did something that Caesar didn't do and what a lot of people would not have done. He also relinquished power as a president. He was still in relatively good health, but he said enough is enough, and he established the norm of a 2-term presidency at that point. But Good. Is Vittorio, we got one more question?
When you mentioned the prison ships, on the slide, they indicated that Fraunces, that they got food to the people in the prison ships.
Yeah.
I just saw that because I've been very interested in that for quite some time in the monument, work being part of everything else. And I was just wondering what happened, how that occurred. I mean, we're able to get the food from here over to the prison ships. That's number one. I have a second question on this question of the impact of the American Revolution and whether people should see the flaws in the founding fathers and so forth. And I wonder if you've ever thought of doing any presentation on the impact of the revolution in Europe and the fact that the greatest minds, people like Mozart, Beaumarchais, running guns to the revolution, or Friedrich Schiller's works, including William Tell and the Bootly Oath, or even the Ode to Joy, with this idea of the celebration of freedom and the way the American Revolution was perceived and supported by these great minds in Europe, whether that would be presented, because I think it does put the revolution in a context of which we can be very proud.
It's a huge question. I don't know if
You take the
you want
second,
to
I'll
do
take the first
take
part.
the second one.
I'll take-
Okay, this was known that the 19th century or following the American Revolution was known as the Age of Revolutions. There were a lot of them. France had had 4 of them. Canada had 1 of them. Ireland had them. Germany had them. With respect to Germany, they had a successful revolution and created a constitutional state, to which the princes said, wait a minute, we're not having this, we got armies. So a lot of refugees came from Germany after 1848, the 48ers, who played a huge role in the Civil War and thereafter. We had Kosciuszko, went back to Poland, created a constitutional government. Catherine the Great and Frederick the Great said, not on our borders. We're not going to have any of this stuff. There were a lot of revolutions that followed the American Revolution. Most of them were not successful for the reason that once you have a revolution, the next question is, what happens next? What happens next made all the difference in a lot of these things. And that's why the American story is so amazing, in that it evolved from not just a change of people in control, but actually the evolution of a new form of government, which ultimately changed the way people in the world govern themselves. But great, Ken?
I cannot improve on that, but I would like to take the first part of the comment about the British prison ships. Fortunately, my wife has left and gone downstairs. She would be unhappy if I said what I'm about to say. There is a theory about the British prison ships. I don't know if it's true or not, and I'm not saying it is true. But the British have a tradition, still does, I think, about how you treat prisoners of war and things that you're obliged to give them. Decent food would be one of them. Well, as we know, the prison ships, which are the most famous, infamous, was the Jersey. They were anchored they were a series of old broken down British transports. They were anchored in what's Wallabout Bay, which is where now the Brooklyn Navy Yard is, more or less. And they died in big numbers. People estimate between 5,000 and 12,000. But this is the theory. Why did they give them such poor food? And the theory is this: the British Quartermaster General, whose wife I cannot remember.
Elizabeth Loring.
What's her name?
Elizabeth Loring.
Loring, Mrs. Loring, was having an affair with the British Commander-in-Chief. And as long as the British commander, may have been Howe, I don't remember. That as long as Howe could have his relationship with Mrs. Loring, he would not blow the whistle on his Quartermaster General, who was selling rotten food and otherwise failing in his responsibilities to the prisoners. I don't know if that's true or not, but that is an allegation that's been circulating around for years.
Okay. Yeah, what Professor Jackson didn't mention was that the quartermaster was the husband of Elizabeth Loring.
Well, that's what I meant.
Which is what I was saying, yeah, this was compensation, he got, yeah, Loring got paid to take care of the prisons and most of it went into his pocket, but yeah, the mortality rate was like 80% in the prisons and the prison ships. It was, just said, you know, who's this story?
So you're saying that's a good theory, it's likely.
It's got a lot of substance, yeah, there's a lot of substance to that, yeah. There is a famous poem in.
Don't anybody tell my wife on the way out.
Well, yeah, and of course, many people have said that we're indebted to Elizabeth Loring because Howe would rather spend time with her than pursue the Americans at Brooklyn or Brandywine or those other places. So, you know, thank goodness for, you know, that relationship. But yeah. That's great. So is Vittorio here?
Yes.
Vittorio, okay. So let's close it out with one of our great resident Italian tenors.
With or without?
Okay. Probably do it either way.
All right, either way, okay. I would like everybody to sing the second verse with me, all right? Same as the first. Okay. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the nights with the lights from above, through the mountains, through the prairies, to the ocean, white with fall. God bless America, my home, a sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home. Yeah. You want to sing a second part? Everybody want to sing with me a second part? God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the nights with the lights from above, from the mountains to the prairies, to the ocean, white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
Thanks so much, everybody, for coming. The museum is open until 5 p.m. today, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the evening. Please feel free to view the exhibitions and Seth Color's collected objects on display here today. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us at Mobiles.